Good day, and welcome to the last podcast in our series, A Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service. I'm the moderator, Geoff St. John. I'm the director of the National Security Studies Program of the Policy Insight Forum, a unit of the Samuel Group of companies. Technical arrangements are brought to you by Geoffrey, the Samuel Group technical specialist. We wrap up our first 5 podcasts today with our panelist, retired Canadian Army General James Cox. Throughout his career, General Cox was an infantry officer of the Royal Canadian Regiment. During his career, he completed 6 operational UN peacekeeping tours and 3 NATO tours. He has trained with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps, and as well with the British Army and Royal Marines. He holds both an MA and a PhD in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada. He last served as Deputy Chief of Staff Intelligence at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. He is now the chair of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Intelligence Network. He admits to being bitten by the intelligence bug some years ago, developing new intelligence concepts, which is why I asked him to be our final panelist. General, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. General, you've listened to the previous podcasts in this series. What would you say are the main arguments advanced by previous panelists in favor of a Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service? And can you think of any other major reasons not mentioned by them?
The reasons I've heard are a range from a reason that I think is weak to a reason I think is reasonably strong in favor of a foreign intelligence service. The weakest argument I heard is that Canada should have a foreign intelligence organization simply because our allies have one. And this whole approach of keeping up with the appearances of the allies, I think, is the wrong approach. And then we had a reason that I think is fairly strong, and that if we had a foreign intelligence organization, it would have the ability to create intelligence that is in keeping with the interests and the priorities of Canada, a Canadian sort of view and assessment of things, and not be always swayed through an American approach or view or perspective, or the same with the British as well. There's another reason in here, I think, that you had expressed in a few of your points, that the advantage of having this foreign intelligence organization is that it would provide a cue to other approaches to intelligence in Canada here. So if we had a human organization, it's possible it would provide a cue to maybe signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, and that
Yes.
And that aspect of working as part of a broader team is appealing, I think.
Some good reasons for having a Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service include the potential of getting high-value human intelligence on selected Canadian intelligence priority. Intelligence which can sometimes answer the decisive question, why? Particularly if the thinking of enemy leaders is revealed by espionage operations. Another reason is provision of much of the intelligence to close allies and getting in return considerable allied human. What do you think about this second point, about the exchange of human with allies?
Yes, that is of value, I suppose, though it depends on the issue. It depends on the target, obviously. It depends on the interest of Canada as part of approaching the issue. In my mind, the exchange of intelligence is one of the important aspects of our intelligence alliances in the first place. So that happens anyway. Again, here in the middle of that, I'm wondering about the aspect I mentioned earlier as to whether the exchange is entirely in favor of Canada or in the clarity of getting a Canadian view involved or in the approach to any issue. The exchange of intelligence, is certainly a part of the game.
Your point about the views of allies perhaps forcing themselves, to use no better term, forcing themselves That depends upon, of course, the distribution of that intelligence within the Canadian government. And I'm thinking now not sharing just with the intelligence community of Canada, but more broadly, providing leaders, senior public servants, senior officers of the Canadian Armed Forces with this intelligence. It's been my experience, at least, that Allied intelligence does not make it usually to the decision makers in Canada, but rather it's the assessments of Canadian intelligence organizations using both our own collected intelligence and that of allies. Has your experience spoken to that issue?
The issue of assessments has tweaked me because it leads me into what I see is a difficulty in this whole sort of question of whether or not Canada needs a foreign intelligence organization. And that is that I haven't heard any conversation that actually stops and talks about the wording that we are using in this discussion. For instance, starting with a definition of intelligence. Interestingly, as you know, in the forces have a definition of intelligence. Yeah. There is no other place in the government of Canada or in the legislation of Canada anywhere that provides a definition of intelligence. And that alone, in my mind, is shocking because we have all kinds of people, all kinds of places who talk about intelligence.
Yes.
But even the people that are reviewing security and intelligence activity, like NSSP and CSIS, have not got a definition of intelligence. So in my mind, I am more in response to your question, I am more inclined to focus on the production of assessment.
Yes.
Is the tool of intelligence, I think. I mean, I've got another view of intelligence as a capacity for the achievement of objectives and the gaining of advantage over an adversary as to whatever it is. Yeah. So in my mind, intelligence is the whole activity that is culminating in advantage and success. The intelligence assessment, I think, is the magic in there. The idea of foreign intelligence, I still, as a number of your people had said, carry out a review, a real one, of the whole intelligence apparatus, clarify definition of intelligence we're talking about, clarify the role of the intelligence assessments in that, and then also talk about and define what is foreign intelligence, because foreign intelligence, obviously, as defined in the forces, or actually it's defined in the CSIS Act, but it's defined in such a way that it's using itself as part of a definition. So if we understand foreign intelligence to be intelligence about a foreign adversary, as to whatever it is, today, that assessment, if we are truly talking about an all-source foreign intelligence assessment, I think it includes more than only the traditional stuff we have talked about in past in terms of security or national security and defense. But because a number of agencies in the government and the ministers in the government have a portfolio that has an international aspect to it. So if we are truly after a true foreign intelligence assessment, I think it needs information from a variety of agencies and offices and departments in the government, which is leading me to the path to say that all the ministers ought to have an intelligence staff. Yes. To acquire information abroad that will eventually feed into a place, an office, a staff, or whatever it is, to produce a real, a comprehensive and useful foreign intelligence assessment.
Those are very good points. They need to be heard by the audience of our podcasts, particularly remark about the definition of intelligence in the first place. Can we come back for a minute to a foreign intelligence service? A number of our previous panelists have all either been in favor of Canadian Foreign Intelligence Service or at least leaned in that direction, and that was not by design, incidentally. But there are reasons why we should not have a foreign intelligence service. What, in your judgment, are the most important of these reasons? In particular, I'm thinking of the possibility that the government of Canada may simply not have the political maturity to run an effective intelligence service, what is obviously an espionage service. Can I have your views on that?
Yes, I think if we are talking in general about arguments against a foreign intelligence organization, as we heard from a number of the previous panelists that you've had, at the top of the list in my mind is finding a reason, a purpose for it, to try and clarify exactly what it is supposed to do is the hard part. Your question or your point on espionage, it leads me to, and I'm going to be more sort of obfuscating here, but in my mind, espionage is not the same as foreign intelligence. And espionage, as you know full well, is a very special sort of a capability and ability to do that. And the people who do it are specialists in a covert activity and all that. I mean, espionage, as we are talking about it here, I think is really, what's the word I want? It's really special. I mean, it's hard to do. In my mind, I would place it in the same category as our JTF-2, which is the top of the line counter-terrorist organization on a par with all of our allies. If we are talking about an equivalent in the world of espionage, then obviously it presents a whole host of challenges to achieve a standard that it has to be. I think in Canada is capable of that because we are capable of producing the folks in JTF-2. They are carrying out operations here and there. So I'm kind of inclined to think the ability of the government, I'll pause there because I'm not sure it's all of the government, but perhaps the people who count in government in terms of security and defense,
right,
I think have all the parts to kind of create and manage this special espionage organization because we have it in place now, as I say, in JTF-2. The challenge, though, there's still, and in my mind, the reason that is prohibiting all this in the first place is that we don't have a true omnibus national security policy that spells out our political objectives or a grand strategy that is producing our strategic objectives. So we, as a whole, our government as a whole, has no idea what it's going to do or the kinds of targets it's got to go and address. And even if it goes and addresses the targets, it has to know the kind of information it wants in order to feed into our assessment. In my mind, the problem isn't so much in the capability itself, it's in the framework of the government that is not in place yet to do it right.
Right. That leads me to a point that I have made elsewhere, and that is a modest-sized service, the sort of modest-sized service that we imagine that Canada would be able to afford, but not more than that, would be limited in the number of targets that it could attack abroad. And as a consequence, the flow of intelligence back from espionage operations would be, in fact, quite limited, perhaps limited to a couple of areas like, for example, Chinese quantum computing research or Russian military capabilities and intentions or nuclear weapons proliferation, but not all of those things. Can you amplify that?
Yes, in my mind, and this is where the exercise of actually clarifying and defining the terms, I think, becomes important. In my mind, espionage and an espionage capability is not the same as a foreign intelligence service. I am thinking of this espionage service as a group of specialists, i.e. the same as JTF2, except in the world of espionage. Yeah. The foreign intelligence aspect, and the foreign intelligence service aspect, the foreign intelligence assessment aspect, I think is a larger discussion. And the question as posed originally, I think, is assuming we want an organization that is producing a foreign intelligence assessment. And the reason I wonder if that's the right path is because if we have this specialist espionage organization who's as capable as any of our allies, and presuming we have targets that we have thought about and we are addressing, as the term goes, we are servicing appropriate targets, my mind is that espionage only produces information. So that you will have agents wherever who acquire information, HUMINT, what I say, it's only information, and it's fed home. After it's fed home, then we can talk about who are the people, who is the organization who takes all that and all of the other information from all the other sources in government and puts it together. So a portion of the challenge of this whole question that we've explored in the past is that I think, and I might be unkind here and unfair, but I think it's been assumed that we want an organization that is plunked into the existing structure of security and governance in the department or in our government. If we allow ourselves to sort of think outside the box there and think of the actual function of producing a foreign intelligence assessment, I see that as a mandatory capability to be had and exercised at the center of government, like in the PCO. I could even argue as to whether the idea of foreign intelligence is relevant anymore, because it depends on the political aims and goals, the strategic aims and goals as to what the target is, and it may be a mixture of foreign stuff or security stuff, and it's almost as if throwing the word foreign in there is complicating it more than it needs to be. If we just say we have an agenda as a country, we have a specific sort of a goal to do the following, we have strategic targets associated with that goal, we need intelligence in order to achieve and prevail over any adversaries, it almost isn't important as to what that intelligence is called. It just has to be predictive and relevant, yes, and to be on time. Yes. And that is just intelligence. And I very often think that we overcomplicate things and confuse ourselves by insisting on adding all of these adjectives to intelligence, where in my mind it's more appropriate to focus on the target and the kind of intelligence that you need for that target. Right. Employ all the platforms you have, right, acquire all the information you have so that you can produce an all-source assessment. The challenge of producing that all-source assessment is where the challenge is in government, because we've heard from others in terms of cost and resources. There's an aspect here that is seldom discussed. It's the recruitment and retention and sustainment of the people who are going to do all this.
Yes.
And I have a complaint here that I think intelligence analysis is more special than only the normal employment in the public service. So I personally, I don't think the same standards and habits and routines of hiring in the public service ought to be applied to intelligence analysis organizations. You need specialists who are seasoned, who know stuff.
Yes.
And if we are truly talking about a national agenda with policy goals and strategic goals, that cannot be just a group of young hotshots in the first instance.
Right.
There are places to do that and train analysts. And in my mind, when you start talking about intelligence analysis at the center of government, or in our words here, a foreign intelligence assessment, I think that has to be a product that's produced by experienced and seasoned individuals who have pulled information in from all kinds of platforms and sources.
Not only secret sources, but of course open sources.
Everything.
Which, for many issues, may be the principal source of intelligence for us. A source of intelligence information, the information, which I think is something that is lost sight of by many people. There's a difference between raw information and finished assessment, and I think you brought that out well. I'll put you on the spot and ask you, on balance, where do you come down on the matter? Do you think, notwithstanding some of the stumbling blocks that you've brought out, do you think that Canada should nevertheless establish a foreign intelligence service, keeping in mind that it will take somewhere around a generation for that service to reach full operational capability?
I have a surprising answer here for you, and well, with great respect, I'm going to ignore the idea of establishing a foreign intelligence service as described and say, in my mind, I would be a fan of establishing a specialist secret espionage organization. So immediately we're talking about an organization that's smaller than the idea of a foreign intelligence organization. I'm thinking, and I've used it before, but the equivalent in espionage world of the folks in JTF2. Employed appropriately, understanding it's going to do all the stuff we know special espionage organizations are going to do, and we have to arrange our laws and our oversight to do that. But I'm in favor of a specialist espionage organization. I'd go so far, and that this is a tempting thought for intelligence officers, I could see an equivalent of the old Camp X.
The World War II Camp X.
Yeah, to train in all their specialties and, all of that. So that would be, but establishing that organization is the instrument. The whole idea, though, of getting the foreign intelligence assessment up and right into the hands of ministers, of cabinet, I think if it was me, I would conflate the ITAC, or the Integrated Terrorist Assessment Center, into the IAS, or the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat, and PCO. I'd put them together, expand on that, and use the intelligence organizations that I would establish in all of our departments. So each of the ministers had his or her own intelligence staff. That's where we would enroll and employ analysts early on in the career. And the older, experienced, polished ones, the ones who know stuff, would eventually sort of rise up. And the people who are used in the intelligence assessment role at the center of government have to be seasoned, polished, experienced, and the best in the country, and at least on a par with our allies. And yes, intelligence assessment is costly in terms of people, because that, as we said early on, this is the vehicle of the whole intelligence purpose to prevail over an adversary. So how can you not argue in favor of having the proven intelligence analyst at the center of government that's working an all-source product of which the specialist espionage organization is providing information into?
Indeed, the question of expanding the all-source intelligence capability, the all-source intelligence assessment capability, is something that I think is most needed in this country. And indeed, before we talk about establishing an espionage service, which you have, I think, properly defined as a small, highly specialized organization, before we do so, we must make sure that the assessment capability is established first.
Right. And the point in the middle of that, I think the important point is, as we know in the world of JDF2, Canada is putting its men and women at risk in these special organizations. Or I think we have a moral responsibility to be sure that we know what our agenda is, what our policy aims are, what our strategic objectives and goals are, before we place any of our Canadian men and women in danger, at the risk of life and limb, to do this special espionage stuff. We have to have a reason to do that, and we cannot deploy any of those espionage specialists if we are not sure and understand why we are placing them at risk.
I couldn't agree more. It's vital that, to use a term, that service spy on those things which address Canadian vital national interests. Nothing else. They should not be spying for nice-to-know information.
Well, and as well, a tricky line here you have to tread. If we are cooperating with allies, is there a point at which we are going to deploy our Canadian espionage experts to acquire a piece of information that's important for an ally? And the answer to that is yes, maybe, but we would have to be careful that we are not treading into the area of becoming an agent of an ally.
Yes.
Only for the sake of appeasing an ally.
Yes.
We have to have a reason to engage in that stuff too, that if it is a benefit for an ally or to an ally, all the better.
Well, certainly Canada and its allies, its close allies, share a number of interests. For example, interest against nuclear weapons proliferation, to take one example. I'm going to ask one last question, and that is the question of whether or not our espionage service, as you've defined it, should be part of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service or should be a standalone agency.
I would say it has to be a standalone agency. And the reason I say standalone is there are issues of accountability here. I think as with all these agencies, security intelligence, it has to be responsive and responsible to and accountable to a minister. And in my mind, the kind of specialist espionage capability I see, it's a different set of skills than currently happens in CSIS. I think there are commonalities in terms of approach and the kinds of people who may be involved in both, but I think this special espionage service ought to be on its own. As a matter of fact, I'd go so far as to say I wouldn't even refer to it as an espionage service. I'd call it, for want of a better term right now, the Canadian Secret Service, because it might not always be involved in pure espionage. It may be involved in influence of some kind that has to go on and work in behind the scenes in a variety of ways, a portion of which are extremely unpleasant.
Yeah. Or secret diplomacy.
Yes, for sure. Now, I must admit, I personally stopped short of the idea of going and assassinating anybody on behalf of Canada.
Of course.
I'm not into that, and I think it would be wrong for the country to sort of wander that path.
That sort of covert action has a history of going badly wrong.
Yes, but the actual skill of getting inside, and as you had said at the beginning, of determining why or the intent of an adversary, I think is a valid activity in defense security of the country, and we ought to have the highest standard, top-notch people who are capable of that kind of activity. I think that we are capable of it. In the end, if it were established, I have a whole host of other arguments and complaints about the extent and the weight of the accountability regime that we have in Canada here, which I think is a burden, but that's another story.
Indeed. General, are there any last thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
I suppose I would only add all this, and this is a personal kind of a plea to people out there. I think the whole intelligence apparatus in the country and the intelligence effort in Canada is capable. The problem is there's no intelligence education in Canada. We have a lot of training schools. Agencies have their own training apparatus. There is no intellectual intelligence education about intelligence overall as a function. There is nobody talking about a philosophy of intelligence. Yeah. There's nobody talking about a theory of intelligence.
Yes.
Conversations on these aspects are happening overseas. They are happening in the U.S. They're happening in the U.K. And our flaw or fault in this whole show, I think, is the absence of recognizing a need for intelligence education on the basis, if we claim intelligence is as important as people are saying it is,
yes,
we have to study it to a proper sort of a degree that is not happening now.
Right. We need an intelligent culture in this country,
Yes.
which we lack currently. General, I want to thank you for your time and your views. This has been most enlightening. I'm particularly happy that you were able to go further afield and talk about the broader issues of intelligence in Canada. Thanks again.
It's a pleasure, and thank you all. I've enjoyed it.
You're more than welcome.